Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about electronic nicotine delivery devices. Our learning objectives for this evening are really to define the mechanics of electronic nicotine delivery devices. We want to summarize the data regarding electronic nicotine delivery devices and nicotine delivery. I want you to understand the health risks of electronic nicotine delivery devices and discuss issues with particularly relevant to adolescents. And then I want you to understand that there are expert recommendations out there on ends, and we need to be aware of what those are. And I will sort of restate them for you. Okay, I do have some relevant financial disclosures. I'm a consultant on a company that doesn't make anything, but they're interested in developing new nicotine delivery systems. So when we talk about vaping, and we talk about the use of electronic nicotine delivery systems, it's important that you use the language of the users, to connect with the users and to, once again, I think we're trying to establish that we're authoritative voices in the field. It's important to know that really what we're talking about and the words we should be using is this is not smoking. No one really considers this to be smoking. This is really vaping. And technically, it's aerosolization. An aerosol is essentially a liquid or a solid suspended in a gas. In this case, it's air. This is very different than the burning process from a conventional cigarette. A conventional cigarette burns at about 1,000 degrees Celsius, and then when we vape, we're actually heating liquid at about 350 degrees Celsius. It's a very different process. I sometimes get the questions, well, why doesn't the vapor smoke look like tobacco smoke? And the answer is it's a completely different process. There's really nothing similar between the two processes. And we'll get in that a little bit more detail so you can understand what I mean. But it's really simple. I mean, the anatomy of every cigarette, you see about 1,000 devices out there, but they're all basically the same. They all have a lithium battery connected to something that heats up or aerosolizes liquid, and then a holder for that liquid, which comes in different forms that we can talk about. But that's really it. There's been a significant evolution in electronic cigarettes over time. And what we see is that when e-cigarettes were first introduced to the United States, or ENDS, electronic nicotine delivery devices, were introduced into the United States in about 2006. And since about 2006, there's been significant evolution. And I'll show you several devices, and then I'll try to come around a little bit to try to help simplify it for you, because I'm a simple person, and I need things to kind of be simple in order for me to make sense of all the chaos that seems to be going on. But there's a couple different paradigms. One is that there were these first generation e-cigarette cigalikes, these second generation tanks, and these third generation e-cigarettes. And the cigalites essentially look like a cigarette. On the right there, you can see that there's a lithium battery, and there is what they call a cartomizer. That top of that part that's disarticulated from the rest of the battery is what they call a cartomizer. That is essentially e-liquid in juxtaposition with a heating element, and it's one unit. It's called a cartomizer, or a cartridge plus atomizer, cartomizer. And they come in different forms. Here's me holding something they call an e-puffer, which has a charging station within the device, as well as a holder for other cartomizers. You heard about vape pens, or you've seen vape pens. These are cylindrical devices that on the right lower corner, they're available at Walgreens. I don't have any disclosures to make about Walgreens, but this one I bought at Walgreens in the lower right-hand corner, and that's really a vape pen. Many of them are button activated. That is, you have to push a button to make it operate and to make it aerosolize. We'll talk about that a bit. You see a lot of these, what we call mod systems. A mod system is essentially a system that you can modify. So if you look at the upper right-hand corner, that is the end. I've got the two pictures in the upper right-hand corner. That device is on its side in the second panel from the right, and it's on its end in the first panel. And on that end, you can see that you can set wattage, and then you see a little connector up there with some grooves. That's what they call a 510 connector. I'm only telling you that because that's why they call it a mod, because you can essentially take all those systems that I have in the lower right-hand corner with those different batteries and interchange what they call atomizers on the different devices. They don't look as cool, but they're interchangeable. They're modifiable. That's why they call them mod systems. And we'll talk a little about the implications of the mod systems, but that's just a general category. A pod system is different. A pod system, like the Juul that you have in the lower right-hand corner, is a system that has a cartomizer type liquid reservoir juxtapositioned with something that heats that liquid. That becomes the pod that you stick onto a battery. So on the left, in that little exploded picture I have, that little plastic cap fixed on that little plastic sort of rectangular thing, and then plugs into that device that I'm holding there in my hand in the middle. And it's a pod system. Why did they make pod systems? Pod systems were really made so that companies could make more money, like Juul. They made a battery that only fit the pods that they made, and then they sold the pods at a 600% markup. And so, you know, you see these pods littered all over the high schools because once you use them, they're very hard to get back into and refill. So that's kind of how Juul made all their money, is they made these very attractive pod systems like on the lower right. And then they sold Juul pods for $24 for a pack of 3 or 4. And so that's important to remember about pod systems as opposed to mod systems. Here are some more pod systems. The one, and you can see one of the most popular after Juul is the one second from the right called the Swarin Drop. And that, as you would imagine, that pod system that tapering end doesn't fit on any other batteries. They're uniquely designed for the system. It just so happens that through the 3 systems on the right are refillable. Not all pod systems are not refillable. It gets pretty academic, but it's important to remember. The other thing is when you take open it, when you look at how these kits come, they come with, in the lower right-hand corner, that's not a Juul, but it's a Juul wannabe. It's called Quit. It usually comes, if people are buying them on the internet, it usually comes with a micro USB, and then it comes with a little bottle that you can put your own e-liquid in, that transparent bottle there, and then you can actually refill that pod. That pod that I have in the upper right has a little green arm that kind of goes around the end of it. You essentially remove that arm and then you can refill that. That's a refillable pod system. Just so you kind of get, and then of course the Juul, right? That we all kind of think about and we all spend a lot of time, you know, wringing our hands about. But that's a lot of complicated. So as I've thought about this for the past 10 years about really what's going on, I've tried to simplify really a couple of things. One is who are we talking about? Who are the users? And then how do they use? And you probably have seen both of these particular types of users. And this helps me understand from a treatment perspective, from an epidemiologic perspective, what do we think about when we think about users who use these devices, and also what are the devices they're using and why are they using them? So I think when we think about adolescents, we want to separate that group broadly from the adults who are using electronic cigarettes to quit smoking. And now there's a lot of blending between the two, and I can get on my soapbox about how I feel about adolescents using anything that's potentially addictive before the age of 25, given my background in addiction, as a preface to say that the reason why we're struggling with this crisis is that the types of behaviors that you see a lot of these kids doing is on the lower right-hand corner, as opposed to the people who are trying to quit smoking, not always, but many times, in the upper left-hand corner. These are 2 different behaviors completely. On the lower right hand, that is a low profile aerosolization of a pod system designed to either escape authorities knowing that they're doing it, or to deliver very high quantities of nicotine. And that's a low profile aerosol with pod systems that have a very high nicotine content, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that created the Juul crisis. When you look at the top system, that is a different system completely. It is what they call sub-ohm vaping, which I'll talk about in a second, with a mod system. Remember what that connector where you can interchange things, where the industry is driving different types of atomizers to go on different types of devices. This will make more sense as I go through the next couple of slides. But I want you to keep these two archetypes in mind, because this is what we need to be thinking about from public health perspective. This is what you need to think about when you're trying to understand the behavior of who's using and when are they using it. And so we'll talk about that. But this is all, so as I like to say, the whole thing, the whole vaping phenomenon is all about the coil. Maybe you've never heard anybody say that, but it's all about the coil. And it has implications for public health. It has implications for nicotine delivery. It has implications for addiction, and it has implications for safety. If you don't understand the coil, you don't understand the phenomenon of what's going on. And you don't have to understand the mechanics of Ohm's law. You just have to understand how this explains the current crisis we're in, and how can we start to articulate from a public health perspective and a personal health perspective a way forward. So if you look at that top behavior, if you look at that big aerosol production, that is a very large coil. And the way that these systems heat e-liquid, which I'll talk about in a second, is they go up to about 350 degrees, and the speed that they get there and the time it takes to heat that coil drives how much aerosol is produced. So that top coil, which has a resistance of 0.4 ohms, I don't know if you can read that, but there is something called a 0.4 ohms, and that ohms is the resistance of that coil. Why does that matter? That matters because that produces the aerosol. That heating, that high heating with that low resistance produces that massive amount of aerosol. Now, what's going on in a Juul-like device? Look at the size of that coil in the lower left-hand corner compared to the size in the upper right-hand corner. It's a totally different behavior, driving a totally different phenomenon. That is low aerosol production and high nicotine content. If you were delivering as much nicotine in a Juul as that person is vaping in the upper, that person would die from nicotine toxicity. That's why the Juul phenomenon and the e-liquid phenomenon, you have to understand the coil, you have to understand the behavior. And there's, just to get a little bit more detailed, because I did say I was going to talk about these devices, and you don't have to remember any of this, but there are 5 different metals, and the metals have health impacts. As we look at the mod systems, there are 2 huge vertically oriented coils on the left, and there's 1 small wimpy horizontally oriented coil on the right. The left is the big aerosol, the right is the Juul type device, the pod. So let's just look in a little bit more detail. So as I look at this picture, I want you to understand that this is a mod system, it's modifiable. And what's going on in that thing that's called an atomizer. And when they're producing that big vape, they need a lot of e-liquid. That drives the size of the glass bulb. And then you can see there's a big coil, and those are 2 large vertically oriented coils. That's how, with all that e-liquid in juxtaposition with 2 large vertically oriented coils, makes a massive amount of aerosol when it's put on that deck and it's plugged into a huge, powerful battery that requires an entire fist to hold. What's driving the size of that battery is the amount of heating and energy that needs to go into making all of that aerosol. When you look at a pod system, it can be a higher resistance coil. You can use a smaller battery. When you look on the right, essentially that little coil that's connected to that positive negative pole that fits in that Juul on the left, this is a Juul, is essentially has that little bit of cotton there. It's right next to the coil. There's a chimney that goes up into the mouthpiece, and then that's inhaled by the user. So let's talk about what's being produced when they produce this aerosol. Well, there's a lot of, we're having a lot of discussions, even at the presidential level, about what we're going to do about flavors. And we know a lot about flavors because there's about 7,700 flavors. This is a picture of a I was going to say dispensary. It's not a dispensary, but a vape shop right next to my house. Well, a couple blocks from my house, and you can see the massive amounts of flavors. They're attractive. They're tasty. Kids love them. But compared to a cigarette that has 6,000 chemicals burning at 1,000 degrees, this is e-liquid vaporization and aerosolization. It has really four main components. It has propylene glycol, and I'll talk about that, vegetable glycerin, nicotine, and flavoring, okay? So when we think about e-liquid flavoring, they're basically chemicals. And you can see that if you want to get a sweet, spicy cinnamon taste, you use cinnamaldehyde, which we know is very toxic to the lungs and is actually a carcinogen. If you want to use a sweet, buttery, creamy flavor, you use diacetyl, which causes popcorn lung. So not all flavors cause bad things, but it's important to remember that this is just basic chemistry making these flavors. And that has important public health implications. What is vegetable glycerin? The history is long, and I can explain it later of where vegetable glycerin and propylene glycol come from. But essentially, the e-liquid industry didn't make it up. It existed before the industry came into being. So why is there vegetable glycerin in there? Glycerin, what is vegetable glycerin? It's glycerol. It's a sweetener. It's a food preservative. And here's me holding a bottle of it that I bought from Amazon so that we could analyze it in the lab. And it's in personal care products. So you buy it in this food grade vegetable glycerin kosher bottle here, and you can make your own e-liquid with it. Propylene glycol. Here's me holding a food grade propylene glycol bottle I bought from Amazon. It's a food additive. It's non-toxic. It's in the asthma inhaler. But what's important and interesting, and one thing I want you to remember from this talk is that when anybody tells you it's in my asthma inhaler, it can't be bad, it's important to remember that an asthma inhaler uses pressure to propel and aerosolize. An e-cigarette uses heat, and anytime you heat something, you fundamentally transform the safety profile of that chemical, and I'll show you that in a second. So why do they mix PG, VG? Essentially, PG carries the nicotine and the flavor, and VG makes the vapor. Essentially it. And VG is very viscous, and PG is a thinner liquid. So that's kind of where you can see the differences in vapor density. You can see differences in throat hit, which have everything to do with nicotine delivery. And then you can see flavors. So let's talk about a nicotine salt. So the reason why Juul was incredibly successful and now are spending their days in court is because they actually delivered nicotine in a higher concentration than anybody had ever delivered before. And the way they did that is through simple pH chemistry. So if you want to understand what Juul is, all you need to understand is this slide. So back when the cigarette industry was making cigarettes and trying to fool the Federal Trade Commission smoking machines, they made the cigarette very basic or alkaline. So remember that on that, I know it's a little bit, you got to go back to high school chemistry or college chemistry, but low pH means very acidic, right? Like citric acid or hydrochloric acid, and high pH is very basic. So it's important to remember that has to do with the acidity of it. And what was happening is when the tobacco industry was fooling the Federal Trade Commission machines and delivering more nicotine, it was freebasing nicotine by making it very alkaline. And when like a high pH of like 8 or 10. And you can see what happens to nicotine is when you get to that pH, you start to non-protonate it. That means it's a free form of nicotine. Why is that important? Because it's the free form of nicotine that's most easily absorbed. So then the e-cigarette industry came along, and it's a fascinating story, and I won't bore you with it, but they essentially stole the ingredients from the tobacco companies and said, we're going to put PG, VG in there, and then we're going to use this very alkaline pH nicotine. And these two thoughtful people from PAX said, but when you actually have a free-base nicotine that you inhale in an electronic cigarette, it makes you want to throw up. I don't know if you've ever had nicotine, and I don't recommend it, but if you ever had nicotine in your mouth, it makes you want to throw up. And the reason is actually teleologic. It has to do with the way we evolved. So what nicotine is nicotine's a pesticide. Nicotine is made by the tobacco plant because it kills bugs. It protects itself from bugs. It just so happened that nicotine was like a very common neurotransmitter in our brain called acetylcholine, and it uses the same neurotransmitter. But as we were evolving as a species, whenever we ate a plant that might kill us, it had an alkaline taste. And that alkaline is on the back of your tongue. And when you taste an alkaline pH something, you want to throw up to protect yourself. So a very alkaline pH nicotine on the back of your tongue is a harsh taste. So these guys said, well, let's make it acidic. There's no reason we can't. And what they did was they took common chemicals and they lowered the pH. It had a smoother taste, and they delivered massive amounts of nicotine. And here's this pH example as we go from acidic to alkaline. Why is that relevant? It's relevant because if you look at traditional e-liquids that have nicotine concentrations of 0 to 18, the nicotine concentrations in Juul were 35 or 59, 2 or 3 times higher than anything that had been ever seen in the industry. And they sold it to kids. And so you can make a hell of a lot of money if you sell drugs to kids, and that's basically what they did. They sold nicotine to kids and made them addicted because they were seeing nicotine levels that their parents never saw. And that's basically the Juul phenomenon. And they knew it because when Juul went into their labs and they said, look, if you look at time and first puff along the x-axis and you show blood nicotine on the y-axis, you can see that a traditional cigarette is that purple line. And if you look at a traditional e-liquid as that blue line, and then you look at what they call the PAX lab platform, which was basically what they call a nicotine salt, you can see the nicotine salt almost approximates that of a combustion cigarette. And it matters because when you look at the urine concentrations of kids who are using pods that have salt in them, they're exposed to more nicotine than kids being exposed to traditional tobacco products such as cigarettes. And I will share my slides with you in the form of a PDF because I am so graphic intense on these that it's like 150 megabytes and you can't deliver it under any circumstance anywhere meaningful. But I can shrink it down to PDFs of the slides and you can have those because that's only like 8 megabytes, and we can figure that out with Joe afterwards there. So what's important to remember is that even though these kids are being exposed to high levels of nicotine, they're not actually getting nicotine delivered at the same rate as with conventional cigarettes. And why is that important? Because kids that start at Juul eventually wind up on Marlboro. Not always, but 4 times more likely. And the reason is when you're dealing with kids during drug experimentation, the drug that will always carry the day and get the most addicts is the one that delivers nicotine or any drug the fastest. And as far as I'm concerned, it's still going to be the conventional tobacco cigarette. Otherwise, why would you have kids switching from Juul to the conventional tobacco cigarette? And this slide proves that. So if you looked at time in minutes in the x-axis and nicotine on the y-axis, when you look at those first generation e-cigarettes, they're not delivering that well. When you look at advanced generations, they're delivering a little bit better. But when you look at that cigarette, when you look at those cigarette smokers, it doesn't deliver exactly as much. Now, that Juul study was a very different study than this study, and it would account for some of the difference because it looked like you could almost approximate the Juul right on top of the cigarette. But in real world studies with real smokers, it actually doesn't prove to be true. But that's how they predicated. So let's talk about the health effects of all the things I just talked about. So now that you know basically how e-cigarettes are constructed, you begin to formulate in your mind all the things that could go wrong, and they do. So here you have a map of identified chemicals in what they call commercial refill fluids. So these are commercially available e-liquids that you can buy on the open market. And you can see concentrations on the right from blue to red, and you can see whether it's an irritant, that is, it makes you annoyed and maybe causes cough, harmful, potentially causes asthma worsening, or toxic, potentially causes cancer. You can see all the different chemicals when you look at these different 69 through 28 different refill liquids. The important thing to remember is the industry is not regulated. We're not having any meaningful regulation coming out of any governmental institute that I can see. So we're not actually regulating it very well. So it's basically the open market. You can go home and buy online something that will cause cancer in 15 years, I guarantee it. Because we're not regulating the industry. So different levels of toxins. The other thing that's important to remember, going back to the asthma inhaler, that the asthma inhaler propels it under pressure and aerosolizes the albuterol. When you propel something under pressure, you don't change the chemistry of it. But when you heat it at 350 degrees, you do. And when you take glycerol, which is vegetable glycerin, and you oxidize it on a nichrome wire, which is one of the metals used in e-cigarettes, you make acrolein, which is an airway irritant. More concerning, when you take propylene glycol and you oxidize it on a nichrome wire at 350 degrees in an e-cigarette, you make formaldehyde. That's a cancer-causing agent. It's important to remember that that heating process makes new chemicals, and that's what we're trying to study in our aerosol lab. Is we're trying to understand the types of chemicals that are conditions that are being produced. And what the literature seems to suggest is that the heating of these e-liquids results in the production of at least 18 additional compounds that don't exist in the non-heated e-liquid. So important. And that directly is related to how high or how much you heat. If you heat that liquid more, which in some of the devices you can change, you can actually increase the amount of formaldehyde you produce, or acetaldehyde. The other thing that you can find is tobacco-specific nitrosamines. Most of the nicotine on the market is extracted from tobacco because it's 18 times more expensive to make nicotine de novo in the lab than it is to extract it from tobacco. So you get a lot of contaminants from the tobacco, and you get what are called tobacco-specific nitrosamines, which can cause cancer, and those have been found in the e-liquids. It's important to remember that when they've done cell studies, when they've taken e-liquid and put them on cells and caused them to mutate, that mutation is not related to nicotine. This is all related to the e-liquid and the chemical changes produced by heating the propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. I talked a lot about the metal, right? This is a metal phenomenon, and you can look at the different types of metals. If you look at these metals are listed, those are their chemical species names in the columns. We got aluminum and chrome and copper and iron and manganese and nickel. And you can see that different parts of the device produce different metals. And as far as I know, it's not a good idea to repeatedly inhale iron and zinc and lead over and over again 100 times a day for 10 years. That could lead to some adverse outcomes. Also, when you heat something, you can actually produce reactive oxygen species, and those can react and increase the risk for certain types of cancer. We know there are direct effects that have been done in human studies. Most of the studies that I've shown you previous to this slide have just been chemical analysis studies, but in human studies, when they actually have humans smoke ends, it actually is associated with increased airway resistance. Even in 2006, I know that we're sort of dealing with this vaping crisis with the electronic cigarette associated lung disease, whatever they're deciding to call it today. It was Valley and then E-Valley and New Valley, and they've got these different names that the CDC is watching. But even before that, everybody said, well, it must be the vaping. And I'm like, when this happened, what, 8 months ago, 10 months ago, and we've had over 2,000 cases and over 50 deaths now, or 46 deaths. Everybody said, oh, it must be the e-cigarette. Well, we've been vaping in this country for 10 years. How come we didn't see it? And the answer is we saw a couple things. We saw a couple cases, to be honest, but they're very different than what we're seeing right now, and I can talk about that in the Q&A. But even back in the day, and this was published a couple years ago now, patients were presenting under certain conditions, having used electronic cigarettes, and were developing certain types of pneumonia that suggested the body was not too happy with chronic exposure to propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin. And some of these cases were found to be lipoid pneumonia. And here's to kind of show you some of the lung disease with the vaping associated injuries. There is some lung disease that we're seeing right now, but I think it's clear, and even if you read the most recent CDC report in the report from the Mayo Clinic proceedings, it looks like it's going to be pegged on cannabis products predominantly. So we can talk about it later, but e-cigarettes are the things I'm talking about right now, and the products I'm talking about right now, in the absence of medical cannabis, are not actually being indicated as a culprit in this disease. So just be very clear that 86% of all the cases of E-Valley, of this acute lung injury out in the communities, is associated with cannabis. The other thing that's important is, since no one's regulating the industry, there are some of these batteries can explode. And I thought it was just a couple of case studies until the case series was published in the New England Journal of Medicine 3 years ago. And, when lithium batteries explode, you can get severe burns, and you can get significant exposure to lead and other toxins and metals in lithium batteries. But you don't have to trust me, but you can listen to the National Academies of Sciences, who reviewed all the data and talked about the public health consequences of e-cigarettes. You can get this full text online if you're interested. Don't recommend printing it out. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages. You can look everything up, though. It's available for you. And the National Academies of Sciences said, there is support for the biological plausibility of tissue injury and disease from long-term exposure to e-cigarette aerosols. And there is biological plausibility in the highlighted yellow portions here that the e-cigarettes could increase risk of cancer and adverse reproductive outcomes. Now, I've heard a lot about this 95%. I'm sorry for the reproduction. It looks a little grainy, but I think it's important because we've all heard that e-cigarettes are 95% safer. I'm like, well, where does that come from? So what Health Canada did is they took all the chemicals they found in traditional tobacco products, and then they looked at all the products that they found in e-cigarettes and just said, is there lead? Yes. How much? Is there nickel? Yes. How much? And compared it. And they said, if you used e-cigarettes compared to a reference cigarette, which is the circle blue on the outside, purple on the outside, there is 95% fewer chemicals in e-cigarettes than in traditional cigarettes. But that's not hard to do, right? Because traditional cigarettes have 6,000 chemicals, right? There's a lot of things that have less chemicals, but that's where that 95% comes from. So let's talk about adolescents. So what are the concerns? So I, in my mind, separate the argument, and I've been to many conferences where all we do is yell at each other about e-cigarettes, and everybody's right and everybody's wrong, and we don't spend a lot of time listening. We don't listen enough in the society, and I think it's become an epidemic. So we yell and try to be louder than the other person, and what we're not hearing is there's an adolescent concern, but there's also the adults who want to quit smoking concern. I don't want to talk about the adults who want to use it to quit smoking. I want to focus on the adolescents right now, but it's a different conversation. But it's not the only voice in the room, but it's an important voice because these are our kids, and they're also the future generations, and they're using more drugs than anybody in their prior history. We are drowning in addiction in this country. There's something seriously wrong with our kids, and this is just another problem that we're trying to manage, right? So why are we so concerned? Because what we're concerned about is we're concerned about the never users who would never smoke a conventional cigarette, who go to electronic cigarettes and then wind up smoking Marlboro. And then in all likelihood, based upon my 25 years of practice, 2/3 of them are going to die from a tobacco-related illness. And I just read a very interesting study that 90% of all people who try one cigarette actually wind up smoking on some or most days. It's a tremendously high proportion of patients who try one cigarette who go on to stay with it, right? So that's the big concern, is ends as a gateway. It's a very hotly contested, debated, and they'll produce all this data in support and against. You pretty much find any data you want to support your argument, but this is a public health concern. And so, what's going on? We're actually seeing that e-cigarettes are attractive. And someone asked me on a radio interview that I recently did, why do you think the e-cigarette craze? And I said, well, number one, Juul. I didn't use their name, but number two, Juul was an interesting confluence of drug and device. Kids love iPhones. Kids love devices. Kids who are experimenting and managing mood and depression and anxiety and all the things that they're being fed today, who are experimenting with drugs to self-manage mood. And I'm convinced, and you can argue with me in the Q&A, that if you are not self-managing mood or anxiety, you do not become a drug addict in most circumstances, okay? It is all about self-management of discomfort and mood and anxiety. That's what this is. And so what was happening is it was the perfect marriage of device and drug. You had a cool device that looked like a flash drive that you could hide in school. You could do low aerosol vaping and not get caught, and no one can body search you. And they just say, don't do that in the bathroom because you can't do it because the laws are that you can't search kids. So, and then also nicotine, which you see. So now what you saw basically from this report is that e-cigarettes surpass conventional cigarettes almost 3-to-1. Because cigarettes are kind of not cool. Cigarettes are expensive. They stink. They smell bad. E-cigarettes you can hide and you can abuse drugs without really getting caught. So that's why. And what's concerning about this is then they go on to smoke conventional cigarettes, because what I said to you a minute ago is the winner in the drug contest will always be the drug that delivers the drug the fastest and the highest concentration. There's very little debate in the addiction literature that the addictiveness of any drug is directly related to how quickly you can get it into the central nervous system and in what concentration. And what I believe is going on is that Juul is delivering lots of nicotine, but mostly in the upper airway, and that the cigarette still is getting a faster pulmonary delivery. So the reason why kids switch is they go, Juul is good, but oh my God, I was at a party last night and Marlboro's better. And so you see a 4 times higher odds of kids going to conventional cigarettes if they've never used, or if they've used an e-cigarette compared to what they didn't. So if you are a kid who used an e-cigarette, you have a 4 times higher odds of going to a conventional cigarette than if you didn't. Okay, so that's important. We can talk about that. A little more granularity I can provide in the Q&A. But don't take it from me. You can take it from the National Academies of Science, who you might trust more, and who said there's substantial evidence that e-cigarette increases risk of using combustible tobacco products among young adults. And tobacco products are what kills. Okay, and the tobacco companies love the fact that we're tearing each other apart and having this huge argument, because once again, what are we not doing? Is regulating tobacco. And tobacco is winning every time. I don't know how the tobacco companies get so lucky that no matter what the debate is, they win every single time. And they're winning again. Because they're saying, yeah, make flavors illegal. Yeah, you bet. Because what will they do? They'll smoke cigarettes, right? So this is the problem. So why are kids using? Experimentation, it tastes good, boredom, all the things that you would expect kids to be doing, and the reason why they're using these products. So when I think about that, I think once again, going back to this idea that when we have a never user, and what's really happening in balance. So there was some interesting modeling here that I'll just insert here for a second. They said, okay, let's look at the entire population of adolescents and ask the question, are more kids using conventional cigarettes than e-cigarettes, or is e-cigarette preventing kids from using conventional cigarettes? If you want to explain this to your friends at the next cocktail party, tell them this, that what probably is happening in the population is that kids who never would have used conventional tobacco are more likely to use conventional tobacco because of e-cigarettes. But what is also true is kids that would have otherwise used conventional cigarettes are probably less likely to use them because they're using e-cigarettes. The question that nobody can answer is which one is more true, and then which one has a more significant health impact, right? Those are the questions that we're fighting about. Okay, so I want to just go to a couple things because I want to talk about adolescence. What's important to remember is that we weren't designed to use drugs. What drugs do is they hijack reward centers in our brain, and we are wired to be rewarded for things that advance the interests of the species, right? We are rewarded in our brain. You know, I don't think the way we were meant to smoke pot and drink alcohol and nicotine. I don't believe that, because what's true about the human brain is that your brain doesn't make any neurotransmitters for which there are no receptors, and your brain doesn't make any receptors for which there are no neurotransmitters. Your brain is a self-contained. It doesn't need something from the outside to make it work. It's self-contained in terms of reinforcement and addiction. All the things you need for reinforcement are the things that you can already do. You can eat and have sex, and you can hug your kids and connect with other people. That's all self-contained. But what we do is we smoke meth and we snort cocaine and we drink alcohol so that we don't have to do those other things, such as connect with other people and run our lives efficiently and be rewarded for things that advance us rather than things that tear us down. So what happens is those neurotransmitters actually hijack your normal built-in system of reward. And so nicotine hijacks the same receptors that acetylcholine, which your body makes, does. And you don't have to do as many things to be rewarded if you're smoking a cigarette, because all you do is smoke your cigarette and you feel happy. But nicotine is a very promiscuous molecule. It goes to a lot of different receptors. And you ask patients of like, why do you smoke? And they say, I don't know, it makes me feel good, or it alleviates my depression. It does all those things on the right. You're like, why isn't there one effect? Because everybody's different, and nicotine acts on many different receptors. And that's why there's all this sort of what we call pleiotropic effects of nicotine. Dopamine's the big one. So if you want to remember one drug, dopamine is the reward, the pleasure, the appetite suppression that you get. There's a quantitative relationship between the amount of dopamine occupancy in the brain and what someone perceives as feeling high or reinforced. And we've done this in animals. You can actually give more drug and you can produce more dopamine. And dopamine release is actually what I said. It's natural rewards in a self-contained system, or it's unnatural rewards where we're taking other things to stimulate our mood, make us feel better, reduce pain. And opioids and stimulants and alcohol, marijuana, and nicotine all do that. They all hijack those reward systems. And the thing that's important to remember, as we hope that this idea that addiction is just a lack of willpower, the thing that's important to remember is where that addiction is happening is just above where your brain tells you to breathe. To understand addiction is to understand that it's a deep neural process that many people have little control over, and they need external help, right? So that's when we talk about treatment. And really, to simplify addiction, you can think about, I think about drugs, I take the drugs, I stop the drugs, I feel bad. I think about the drugs, I take the drugs, I stop the drugs, I feel bad. This is a cycle of addiction. And this is what happens with our kids with Juul. Why is it relevant? Because this is what's going on with our kids right now with nicotine. And adolescents are very sensitive. So if I was king of the world, make me king of the world tomorrow, and what I would do for the entire world to help solve the crisis in this country particularly, we're drowning in addiction. Drowning. And it's going to get worse because everybody wants to legalize cannabis and just throw that onto the fire, right? So you basically make every drug completely inaccessible to anybody until the age of 25. 99% of all addiction starts before the age of 25. When you take a brain that's developing to the age of 25 and you put a chemical in there, you can fundamentally change, potentially forever, the neurochemistry of how that brain operates. And we know that to be true. The likelihood of anybody being addicted to a potentially addictive substance, if they started after the age of 25, is almost zero, if not zero. So adolescent rodents, which are the only model we can use, have higher levels of nicotine self-administration. They have less sensitivity to adverse effects. They have less withdrawal symptoms. There's strong dose dependent associations. And you go, well, kids aren't rats, right? But exposure, tobacco and nicotine exposure has been linked in humans to attention problems, working memory problems. All the reports you're hearing is the kids that are using Juul can't exercise anymore and they can't pay attention in class. They're like kids with ADD because they're amped up on nicotine, right? And it has impairment in functional memory and verbal memory and cognitive performance. And the question is, well, is it tobacco rather than nicotine? I think Juul proved to us beyond a reasonable doubt that this is not tobacco that does this. That this is a nicotine exposure phenomenon in a developing brain in a particularly critical period of development, which is before the age of 25. And we know that tobacco product use in general is associated with anxiety. There's probably a bidirectional relationship with kids with ADHD. That is, kids with ADHD use nicotine to help their symptoms, but if they don't have ADHD and they use nicotine, they're more likely to have a manifestation of ADHD symptoms. And also causal in depression. So all of that sort of added up to this phenomenon of when you look at e-cigarette sales and you look at Japan tobacco and British American tobacco, you basically have this massive marriage between drug and device on an epic scale and sell it in every Casey's corner store. You see what happened in 2016. After 2017 and 2018, it was the dominant force in the market, delivering high levels of nicotine to our kids. Well, what do the experts say? I told you what the National Academies of Health say in terms of switching the conversation. So let me just finish up with adolescents by saying that under no circumstances, in my humble opinion, and you may have other opinions, should kids have access to potentially addictive substances till the age of 25. But we don't do that. We make it 18, we make it 21. We argue with the congressmen about, well, if they can fly a plane, they should be able to smoke cigarettes. So these sorts of things is very different in the addiction field because we see the disastrous consequences and I watch people die. So, it's a different on this end of the battlefield. So no kid should be using Juul. No kid should be using any type of flavor. We should not have access for kids. And that's my opinion. We can argue about it, but that's what I live with. And that's how I sleep at night. Now, what's going on with the adults who smoke? Because you are going to see patients who, I quit smoking and I'm using this thing, and these are adults and they're 40 years old and they're making adult choices and they're not selling it to kids. So what about e-cigarettes for smoking cessation? Because that's the other voice in the room on this debate. Okay. And the other voice in the room on this debate is that at least our government doesn't think that there's sufficient evidence to think that e-cigarettes should be used for smoking cessation. So that's what the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. But different health societies have different opinions. The American Cancer Society says, okay, so we think that the 95% data is true, and that if you want to switch from conventional tobacco cigarettes, which they have an interest in having you not be on because of all the cancer it causes, we think e-cigarettes is preferable. What about the American Heart? Well, if you tried other things, then you can try. American Lung is like, no way. They've got too much skin in the game, right? So it's different depending upon which expert panel is concluding that. So basically, I'm wrapping up right at 8 o'clock. We're going to have some Q&A, but I really wanted to help you. I wanted to define the mechanics of ENDS. I wanted to talk about the data regarding ENDS and nicotine delivery. Very important discussion. We don't have all the answers. We're still learning about it in our lab, in our inhaled particle aerosol lab, trying to understand what's going on with the chemicals and with the chemistry. So we don't have all the answers right now, but we're learning. I wanted you to understand what the known health risks are. And it's very hard in a population until you have 50 years of a consistent product use to be able to tell what the long-term effects are, right? We started smoking heavily in this country in the early 1900s. It wasn't until 1950 that we actually had a case control study published in JAMA associating lung cancer with smoking. So it takes a long time. Discuss adolescence, some particularly cogent opinions, hopefully, about adolescence, and then identify what the experts say about ENDS.